What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action hero comes face to face with daytime television's most controversial hosts? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to find himself trapped in a verbal minefield that would end with one of the most explosive exits in television history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these worlds collide in the most unexpected way. The studio lights blazed hot as Harrison Ford settled into the familiar beige couch, his weathered hands clasped together with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down countless interviews over his decades-long career. At 78, Ford had seen it all, survived it all, and maintained his reputation as one of Hollywood's most respected figures. This morning appearance on The View was meant to be straightforward promotional fare for his latest project, a simple 20-minute segment that would have him back in his car before the New York traffic reached its midday peak. The show's opening theme music still echoed through Studio 23B as Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her moderator's chair, that familiar smirk playing across her lips. To her left, Joy Behar shuffled through her note cards with barely concealed excitement, while Sunny Hostin adjusted her glasses and Sarah Haynes maintained her perpetually bright smile. The energy in the room felt different today, charged with an undercurrent that Ford couldn't quite place but definitely didn't like. "So Harrison," Whoopi began, her voice carrying that deceptively casual tone that veteran talk show guests learn to fear. "We're here to talk about your new film, but I have to ask about something that's been making headlines lately." She paused, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make Ford's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Your recent comments about the film industry and what you called the woke agenda have stirred up quite a bit of controversy." Ford's eyes narrowed slightly, the first sign of the storm brewing beneath his famously controlled exterior. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about what I actually said," he replied carefully, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had navigated treacherous interview waters before. "I was talking about the importance of storytelling, remaining authentic, not pushing any particular agenda." Joy Behar couldn't contain herself, practically bouncing in her seat as she jumped in. "But Harrison, come on. When you say things like that, you have to know how it sounds to people who are fighting for representation in Hollywood. I mean, are you really suggesting that diverse casting and inclusive storytelling is somehow inauthentic?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Ford's expression hardened. "That's not what I said, and that's exactly the kind of interpretation that creates problems," he responded, his voice gaining an edge that longtime Ford watchers would recognize as dangerous territory. "I believe in good stories, period. When you start with an agenda, any agenda, the story suffers." Sunny Hostin leaned forward, her prosecutor instincts kicking in as she sensed weakness. "But isn't that easy to say when you've been the beneficiary of a system that primarily told stories about people who look like you? When marginalized communities finally get a chance to see themselves represented, calling it agenda-driven sounds a lot like you're uncomfortable with sharing that space." Ford's hands clenched together more tightly, his knuckles beginning to show white. The cameras caught every micro-expression as decades of media training warred with his natural instinct to speak his mind. "I've worked with talented people from every background throughout my career," he said slowly, each word carefully measured. "I don't need lectures on diversity from anyone in this room." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Whoopi's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Oh, now that's interesting," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "So you think we don't know what we're talking about when it comes to representation and inclusion? That's a pretty bold statement coming from someone who's made hundreds of millions playing characters who were specifically written for white men." Ford's jaw worked silently for a moment, his legendary composure beginning to crack around the edges. "That's not what I meant, and you know it," he said, his voice dropping to a register that his co-stars would recognize from his most intense dramatic scenes. "I'm talking about the craft of storytelling, not making assumptions about anyone's qualifications or experiences." But the host smelled blood in the water now, and Sarah Haynes jumped in with the kind of seemingly innocent question that was anything but. "Harrison, I think what we're trying to understand is whether you believe that stories told from different perspectives, stories that center characters who aren't traditionally the heroes of Hollywood blockbusters, are somehow less authentic or less valid than the types of films you've been in. The question was a masterclass in television manipulation, phrased in a way that made any direct answer sound defensive while creating a no-win scenario for the increasingly uncomfortable guest. Ford's media instincts were screaming warnings, but his pride as a craftsman and his frustration with what he saw as deliberate misrepresentation were pushing him toward a confrontation that would define this interview. "Look," Ford said, his voice gaining intensity as he leaned forward slightly. "I've spent 50 years in this business, and I know the difference between authentic storytelling and checkbox casting. When you prioritize representation over talent, everyone suffers, including the communities you're supposedly trying to help." The studio fell dead silent for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that television producers dream about because they know it means they've captured something genuinely explosive. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath as the full implications of Ford's words settled over the room like a toxic cloud. That Whoopi's expression shifted from mock surprise to genuine anger, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did you just suggest that diverse actors are less talented than white actors? Because that's what I just heard, and I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly." Ford realized immediately that he had stepped into quicksand, but his instinct was to keep fighting rather than apologize. "That's not what I said, and the fact that you're twisting my words proves exactly what's wrong with these conversations," he shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "You can't have an honest discussion about craft and quality without someone screaming racism." The room erupted as all four hosts began talking at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of outrage and indignation. Joy Behar's voice cut through the chaos. "Honest discussion?" Honest discussion would be acknowledging that talented actors of color were systematically excluded from opportunities for decades. But Ford wasn't backing down now, his legendary temper finally breaking free from the constraints of media training and public relations coaching. The man who had faced down directors, studio executives, and even presidents was not about to be lectured by television hosts, and the confrontation was only just beginning to reach its explosive potential. The veins in Ford's neck became visible. As he straightened in his chair, his voice cutting through the overlapping chatter with the kind of authority that had commanded respect on film sets for half a century. "You want to talk about exclusion? Let's talk about how you're excluding honest conversation by immediately labeling anyone who disagrees with your narrative as a racist." Sunny Hostin's eyes flashed with prosecutorial fire as she pointed directly at Ford. "Your narrative? Harrison, this isn't about narratives. This is about facts. The fact is that Hollywood has a documented history of discrimination, and when people like you suggest that diversity initiatives are somehow lowering standards, you're perpetuating that discrimination." Ford's laugh was harsh and bitter, the sound of a man who had reached his breaking point. "People like me? You mean people who've actually worked in this industry longer than you've been alive? People who've seen real talent get overlooked for politics on both sides?" His voice rose another octave, and crew members began exchanging nervous glances. "I've worked with some of the most talented actors in the world, and their race never mattered because their talent spoke for itself." Joy Behar slammed her palm on the table, the sharp crack echoing through the studio. "Oh, please. That's the oldest line in the book. I don't see color." "Well, maybe that's the problem, Harrison. Maybe you should see color, because the rest of us have been living with the consequences of a system that definitely saw color when it was making decisions about who got to be the hero and who got to be the sidekick." The studio audience, which had been murmuring quietly, fell into a stunned silence as they witnessed what was clearly becoming a career-defining moment for everyone involved. Ford's publicist, watching from the wings, was frantically trying to get the attention of the show's producers, but it was far too late to stop the runaway train this interview had become. Ford leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting had. "You know what the real problem is? People like you who make everything about race instead of letting talent speak for itself. You've created an environment where nobody can have an honest conversation about quality without being attacked." Whoopi's face contorted with barely controlled rage as she jabbed her finger toward Ford. "Honest conversation? You want honest? Here's honest. You're sitting here as a beneficiary of a system that gave you opportunities based on your race and gender, and now that other people are finally getting those same opportunities, you're calling it unfair. That's not honest, Harrison. That's hypocritical. The words hit Ford like a physical blow, and for a moment, something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold fury that had made his on-screen villains so memorably terrifying. I earned every role I ever got. I auditioned, I worked, I delivered. I didn't get handed anything because of my race, and I'm not going to sit here and let you diminish my career to make your political points. Sarah Haynes, sensing that the conversation was spiraling completely out of control, attempted to inject some civility back into the proceedings. Harrison, I think what we're trying to say is that the industry is finally making room for voices that were previously excluded, and that's a good thing for everyone, including audiences who want to see different perspectives. But Ford was beyond reason now, his decades of pent-up frustration with what he saw as political correctness run amok finally exploding into the open. Different perspectives? You mean the perspective that everything successful was built on oppression? The perspective that merit doesn't matter if you have the wrong skin color? That's not progress. That's discrimination with a new coat of paint. The studio erupted again, but this time the chaos was different, more intense, more personal. Sunny Hostin was on her feet, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. How dare you sit there and talk about discrimination when you've never experienced it? You've never been told you weren't right for a part because of your race. You've never had to work twice as hard to be considered half as good. Ford shot to his feet as well, towering over the table with the intimidating presence that had made him a movie star. And you've never had to watch your industry get turned into a political battlefield where talent takes a back seat to demographics. You've never had to watch great stories get sacrificed on the altar of social justice. Joy Behar's voice reached a fever pitch as she practically screamed across the table. Social justice? You mean justice, period. You mean finally giving people the opportunities they were denied for decades. If that threatens you, then maybe you need to examine why. The confrontation had reached a point where personal attacks were becoming inevitable, where professional courtesy had completely broken down, and where the carefully maintained facade of daytime television civility had been shattered beyond repair. Ford's chest was heaving with rage and indignation, while the host seemed energized by their ability to crack the composure of one of Hollywood's most respected figures. Whoopi delivered what she clearly intended as the killing blow, her voice dripping with disdain. You know what, Harrison? This whole conversation proves exactly why we need more diversity behind the camera and in front of it. Because clearly, some people in Hollywood are more interested in protecting their privilege than creating better entertainment. Ford's eyes narrowed to slits, and when he spoke, his voice carried a finality that everyone in the room recognized as the point of no return. My privilege? Lady, I've been working since before you knew what a movie camera was. I've earned my place in this industry through 50 years of dedication, and I'm not going to let a bunch of talk show hosts who've never created anything tear that down to score political points. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the collective intake of breath from everyone in the studio made it clear that Ford had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The hosts' faces registered shock, fury, and something approaching vindication. They had successfully goaded one of Hollywood's most beloved figures into revealing what they would certainly characterize as his true nature. But Ford wasn't finished. And the final explosion was still to come. The silence that followed Ford's devastating insult lasted exactly 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in Studio 23B. Then Whoopi Goldberg rose from her chair with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had just been pushed past every conceivable limit, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. Talk show hosts who've never created anything, she repeated, her words dripping with venom. Harrison, I've got an Oscar sitting on my mantle at home. I've created more meaningful entertainment in 1 year than you have in your entire career. Of running around in leather jackets and fedoras, playing the same character over and over again. The personal attack landed like a physical blow, and Ford's face flushed red with a rage that seemed to consume him from within. Meaningful entertainment? You mean sitting around this table every day, spreading poison and division? You mean attacking guests who come here in good faith to promote their work? That's your contribution to entertainment. Joy Behar was practically vibrating with indignation as she joined the full-scale assault. Good faith? You came here with your racist talking points and your victim complex. You can't handle the fact that Hollywood is finally moving beyond old white men as the default heroes, so you dress up your bigotry as concern for equality. Ford's composure, already hanging by a thread, finally snapped completely. Racist? You want to call me a racist? I've worked with more diverse casts than any of you have ever dreamed of. I've championed young actors, I've mentored people from every background, and I've never once made a decision based on someone's race or gender. But apparently, that's not enough for you people. The phrase "you people" detonated in the room like a bomb, and suddenly everyone was on their feet, voices raised in a cacophony of outrage and accusation. Sunny Hostin's legal training kicked in as she pointed an accusatory finger directly at Ford's face. You people. Did you just say "you people" to a table of women, including women of color? Are you kidding me right now? This is exactly what we're talking about. The mask slipping when you get challenged. Ford realized his mistake immediately, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Don't twist my words. I meant people who make everything about race and politics instead of focusing on the work. I meant people who can't have a conversation without attacking someone's character. Sarah Haynes, who had been trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism, finally abandoned all pretense of civility. Your character is what's on display here, Harrison. Your character is what's making you think that diversity and inclusion are attacks on your legacy instead of improvements to an industry that needed fixing. Ford's voice reached a volume that made the sound technicians scramble to adjust their levels. My legacy? I've entertained millions of people. I've brought joy to families around the world. I've created characters that have inspired generations. And you want to tear that down because I won't bow down to your political agenda. Whoopi's response was swift and merciless. Nobody's tearing down your legacy, Harrison. You're doing that all by yourself, right here, right now, in front of millions of viewers. You're showing everyone exactly who you really are when you're not playing a character. The words hit Ford like a sledgehammer, and for a moment, the fight seemed to go out of him. But then something harder and more bitter replaced it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the cold finality of a man who had nothing left to lose. You know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. I am showing everyone who I really am. I'm someone who believes in merit over politics. I'm someone who thinks talent should matter more than demographics. I'm someone who believes in the craft of storytelling over social engineering. And if that makes me the villain in your narrative, then so be it. Joy Behar leaned across the table, her voice dripping with contempt. It doesn't make you a villain, Harrison. It makes you irrelevant. It makes you a relic of a system that the rest of us are working to fix. And the fact that you can't see that, the fact that you're fighting so hard to protect something that was never yours to begin with, just proves how necessary that change really is. Ford stood completely still for a moment, absorbing the full impact of what had just been said to him. Then, with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had made a final decision, he reached up and removed his wireless microphone, the small device making a soft clicking sound as he unclipped it from his shirt. I've been in this business for 50 years, he said quietly, his voice now carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more unsettling than all his previous shouting. I've worked with legends, I've created classics, and I've earned the respect of my peers through dedication and professionalism. I don't need to sit here and be lectured by people who think entertainment is a weapon instead of an art form. He placed the microphone carefully on the coffee table, the small gesture somehow carrying enormous weight. I came here to talk about my work, to share something I'm proud of with your audience. Instead, I walked into an ambush designed to make me look like a monster for having the audacity to believe that quality should matter more than quotas. Whoopi made one final attempt to get the last word. Nobody ambushed you, Harrison. We asked you reasonable questions about your public statements, and you chose to double down on positions that a lot of people find problematic. Ford's laugh was bitter and final. Problematic. That's your word for anyone who doesn't agree with your worldview, isn't it? Well, here's something that's actually problematic. Turning every conversation into a political battlefield and then acting surprised. When people fight back, he turned toward the studio exit, but paused to deliver his parting shot. You want to know what's really killing this industry? It's not lack of diversity. It's people like you who think tearing down successful people makes unsuccessful people more successful. It's the idea that everything has to be a statement instead of just being entertaining. The silence that followed was deafening. Ford walked toward the studio exit with the measured pace of a man who had said everything he needed to say. His footsteps echoed in the suddenly quiet space, each step marking the end of what had started as a routine promotional appearance and had become one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. As he reached the studio door, Ford turned back one final time, his eyes sweeping across the four women who had just participated in what would undoubtedly become a defining moment in all their careers. "You got what you wanted," he said simply. "You got your moment. I hope it was worth it." The heavy studio door closed behind him with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the building. The hosts sat in stunned silence, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly giving way to the realization of what had just transpired. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the aftermath, every shocked expression, every labored breath. In the control room, producers were already making frantic phone calls, knowing they had just witnessed television history. The audience sat in complete silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply process what they had just witnessed. The show would continue, of course, but everyone in Studio 23B knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again.